We continue our work in the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and our next topic is the roundtable on the topic of an effective mechanism for the presidential impeachment as a prevention of power usurpation and a way to avoid revolutions. I would like to emphasize that our press center does not take any responsibility for the views expressed by the participants of this roundtable or any other events that we hold. Especially if this information is incomplete or untruthful, we disclaim any responsibility for the views expressed by the speakers and disclaim any responsibility for any possible damages caused to the third parties. Let me now turn the floor over to our moderator. Let me now introduce our speakers, and before we start our discussion, let me introduce our guests today. It's Mr. Vasyl Hatsko, the co-chairman of the Democratic Alliance political party, Yurii Derevyanko, People's Member of Parliament, Dmytro Dobrodomov, People's Deputy Member of Parliament, political movement Ruch Novych Sil, Natalia Novak, People's also the MP from Petro Poroshenko's Bloc, political bloc. Again, our topic today is an effective mechanism for the presidential impeachment as a prevention of power usurpation and a way to avoid revolution. We want to discuss why this is important and why the impeachment procedure is blocked. Its legislative determination is blocked by certain political forces. We all know that there is a mentioning of the possibility of the option of an option of impeachment in Ukraine's constitution, but there is no law establishing the procedure. So today, with all the contradictions that we have in Ukrainian political circles and in the political life of this country, we feel the need to discuss that and give the floor respectively to all the representatives of political forces who volunteered to express their views on that. Let us make our discussion two-faceted, so to say. The first would be the view of the outlook of today's political situation in the country, and the second facet of how to make an effective mechanism of impeachment, how it is viewed by the political forces of Ukraine. We are going to discuss that issue as well. What could be a model for this impeachment procedure or mechanism of impeachment? Let me invite Mr. Maksym Cherkasenko, who is a member of the Democratic Alliance political party. Thank you. I would like to offer you my presentation, if we have a technical capacity for that. Well, while our technical assistants are preparing the broadcast of this presentation, let me express my agreement with Ms. Natalia, who pointed out the divergencies, if not outright contradictions, among political forces of Ukraine with regard to the impeachment procedure. We have heard recently among the participants of many street manifestations these calls for the adoption of the special law on impeachment, specific law on the impeachment procedure. We now we have already mentioned that the Constitution mentions this option, but in the last over 20 years of this Constitution being in force, it has never, this option has never been used. So before we start discussing what this mechanism of impeachment is going to be, let us first define the impeachment itself. According to the Constitutional Court's definition of 2003, the procedure of impeachment is an out-of-court parliamentary procedure within the framework of which the parliament can stop or suspend the authorities of the president even before his term ends in office, and through an ordinary criminal procedure, he or she can also be practically tried for any wrongdoings that commitment of which has caused the impeachment effort. We view the impeachment as an instrument that would prevent any president from committing any crime or crimes in the countries where this mechanism has been used. The presidents try to avoid breaching the Constitution, being fully aware of the possible consequences in the form of, namely, the impeachment procedure. There have been recent, very well-known examples. In Brazil, for example, there was the impeachment mechanism used in South Korea, and there were clearly defined wrongdoings that caused this impeachment procedure being invoked. This procedure is also can also be viewed as an instrument or as a leverage, instrument of leverage, parliamentary leverage, with regard to the presidency. And the last function of the impeachment that we can mention here is that it is an impediment, or rather the check and balance with regard to wrongdoings or breaches of the law by the president, which helps to avoid major social conflagrations, street manifestations, and so on. So, in the end, it's also a mechanism that can also activate the punitive function against the president who breaches the law. But that is the means of last resort, so to say. Article 13 of the Constitution that we have mentioned already is the article where this impeachment procedure mentioned. It's rather cumbersome. It includes 7 stages, and we need first to define the grounds for the impeachment. The Constitution says that it's high treason or any other crime. That's how the Constitution defines it. In the legislations of the other countries, there are also such breaches, such things as breaches of law, or are there any other violations of law that, in the view of the parliament of a given country, constitutes a breach of law that is in effect in a given country. According to Ukraine's constitution, modern constitution, 326 votes are needed, which is more than the so-called constitutional majority, the 2/3 of the total number of votes of the MPs. It also provides for the establishment of a special investigative committee, which is composed of the special prosecutors and special investigators. And here we have this, so to say, gap, constitutional gap, because the law, the constitution, does not say anything about how this commission can be formed, who can be the members, who can be appointed as those special prosecutors or investigators. We only know from the constitution that the function of this commission is to present to the parliament, to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, its findings, which are supposed to be, or which need to be, sustained by 2/3 of the MPs. We also need to point out that the decision of removing the president from his position is adopted by the parliament, and in Ukraine's constitution says that after there is after the indictment is formally put forward with regard to the president, or regarding the president, incumbent president, after that this commission starts working, and upon its conclusions the parliament votes and needs to adopt the decision to remove the president by 3/4 of the votes, which is 338 votes out of 450 that is the current composition of Ukraine's parliament. In the majority of foreign countries, it's 2/3 of the votes that is needed. In the countries, neighboring countries like Belarus or Kazakhstan, similar to Ukrainian norm is effective, which is 3/4 of the votes are required to endorse the decision to remove the president, a president from his position. So Ukraine's constitution of 1996 that has been in force since 1996. This procedure of impeachment has never been not only used but even initiated. We remember, though, that in the second term of Mr. Kuchma's presidency, there were 4 motions, draft resolutions of the parliament, registered at the parliament and reviewed by the parliament. You might remember that at that time, in the late 90s, there were very strong accusations and very vocal accusations leveled against the president, accusing him of ordering the assassination of Georgy Gengantse, one of the journalists, popular journalists at that time. And although the protests caused we might say were one of the causes that provoked or caused the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004, when Mr. Yushchenko came to power, and there were a lot of protests at that time, as you remember. They were peaceful, thanks God, no violence was used. And although he was very popular at the beginning, by the end of his term, there were a number of motions by the MPs and draft resolutions of the parliament calling for the removal of Mr. Yushchenko from office. The last case was under Mr. Yanukovych's presidency, when in 2014 the protests were transformed into what we now know under the Arabic term of Maidan, and that procedure was not used against Mr. Yanukovych because, in my view, because it was rather cumbersome. And there were the growing protests that made Mr. Yanukovych to flee the country. So again, this procedure had not been used before he fled the country. And in my view, at that time, it could be a way out of that explosive situation. Well, the initiative on the impeachment of an incumbent president was also emerged in the current parliament in 2016, after Panama Papers were published. But in 2016, the MPs did not even manage to get enough votes to register their draft resolution, probably being aware of how unrealistic was the practical application of that cumbersome impeachment procedure in the form that it has in the Constitution. I would also like to add maybe just a few words to the description of this situation. In my view, we already have a tradition, one might say, of the breaches of the Constitution by the presidents, starting with Mr. Kuchma, who breached the Constitution by amending the Constitution, turning Ukraine from the parliamentary presidential republic into presidential parliamentary republic. Mr. Yushchenko gained his power using the Constitution of 1996, but then this Constitution of 2004, there was an attempt to use that later version. And there have been a whole range of different breaches of both Constitution and different other laws in presidential executive orders issued by various presidents. The presidents practically have been meddling with the powers of the executive branch, like, for example, trying to appoint their own cronies, their appointees in different leading positions in the government and local administrations, as we call the local governments. And the whole range of minor violations, like, for example, signing or non-signing the laws within the 15 days term established by the Constitution. Many of them didn't do that. And various other contradictions and disputes between the presidency and the parliament, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Also the breaches regarding the appointment of the members of the Supreme Court of the country. There were contradictions between the actions of the presidents and the constitution of the country. So they were basically trying to exercise the authorities that they didn't have under the constitution, the presidents, that is. So, as we see that the Constitution establishes as a foundation for, as a reason for the initiation of the impeachment procedure, the high treason, there certainly can hardly be any prospect of ever invoking this article against any president. Another hurdle is that it's going to be very difficult to get enough votes to make Parliament vote in support of the impeachment procedure. So this all makes it very difficult, this impeachment procedure, to be realistically used by the Parliament of Ukraine. Again, the role of the Supreme Court is puts also into doubt the prospects of the better definition of this procedure in view of many jurists, law specialists. The Supreme Court, in its opinion that it is supposed to provide, whether there was high treason or not, or any other breach of the Constitution, this very notion of the conclusion of the opinion or the judgment by the Supreme Court is also very vague according to the existing laws. Therefore, in my view, participation of the Supreme Court in this procedure is not at all needed. Another aspect that I have already mentioned, the participation of some other agents of this procedure, like, for example, the Special Investigative Committee that I have mentioned, and their relations with the Parliament. So our proposal, founded or based on an approach that has been developed by the Constitutional Reform Group of the Reanimation Reform Package. For example, Mr. Musiyaka is one of the participants of that group, and Ms. Yulia Kyrychenko, who is also a prominent lawyer, also Mr. Vladimir Shapoval, Vladimir Kozubra, Ihor Koliushko, and the other constitutional law specialists. They have all expressed their views on the prospects for this impeachment mechanism. They suggested that Article 111 be amended, of the Constitution, that is. So these, in that slide, you can see these amendments that they propose. Like, for example, the basis for the impeachment. They suggest that the breach of the Constitution should be included, and the words that we have in the current version of the Constitution, other crimes, it says, they suggest that it be replaced with other intentional crimes, this formulation. The initiation of the procedure can remain the same. It could be initiated by 126 votes of the Parliament. Then the next stage, the Special Investigation Committee, its conclusions. The next stage, they suggest that it be eliminated, this vote of the 2/3 of the MPs, 300 votes. we suggest that this stage be eliminated as such, and there will only be two stages remaining: the initiation of the procedure and then the decision, the vote in support of endorsing that decision. But it's up to the Constitutional Court that should work out its conclusion on the workings of this investigative committee and the acts of the parliament, where if there have not been by any chance any violations by the MPs themselves, by the parliament itself, of the constitutional procedure of the impeachment. As soon as we have all these changes in place, we are certain that it will make any president be more attentive with regard to the role of the parliament, and it will be, so to say, a safeguard. It will vouch against, if we may say so, against any violations, any breaches by any president, incumbent president of the Constitution and the other laws of the country. So how can we how can we introduce these changes? We can adopt a separate law, a special law, and or as Mr. Derevyanko suggests, both the MPs and the constitutional law experts have since 1996 been suggesting that a number of gaps that we now have in the current constitution be filled, the text be improved. Among their proposals and suggestions was this specific law on the impeachment procedure. According to my calculations, there have been 9 drafts of the resolutions of Verkhovna Rada that were introduced by various MPs. None of them has ever been enacted by the parliament. Mr. Derevyanko, I guess, will inform us about his efforts in this area. Now we are at the stage when we need at least 150 votes, or signatures rather, by the MPs for the draft resolution to be included into the order of business of the Verkhovna Rada. After that, it should be forwarded to the Constitutional Court for its definition whether it corresponds to the Constitution, and after that there should be a constitutional majority vote in the Parliament, as it's about the amendment of the Constitution itself. So 300 votes are going to be needed. So after that article of the Constitution is amended and the procedure is simplified, then there might be some changes, some amendments introduced into the regulation of the parliament itself, its procedures, regulating its procedures. So these are briefly our views on how this issue can be tackled. So that was one way of making this impeachment mechanism or procedure more realistic, more effective. It's the simplification, in essence, of this procedure. Mr. Maksym Cherkasenko sounded us out on that. And now Mr. Derevyanko will inform us about his vision of the introduction of this impeachment procedure. Ruch Nových Sil political party, Yurii Derevyanko. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I will try to not to repeat myself. Substantiating or arguing for the need of this very procedure of impeachment. Let me limit myself to state that we need the law on impeachment in order to avoid any further revolutions in the future. I entirely agree with the fact that Article 111 of the Constitution of Ukraine was the article, deficiency of which we may say allowed many presidents, practically all presidents, all Ukrainian presidents, to breach constitution. It even happened with the current president, with the incumbent president. The reason, in my view, again, is that there is no impeachment mechanism as such with the formula that we have in the Constitution that tries to describe it somehow, to establish it somehow. Let me inform you about our suggestions. We want to amend the article of the Constitution that regulates the activity of the office of the president, of the presidency itself, how the president exercises his powers. Article 106 of the Constitution clearly states the authorities, lists the authorities and the functions of the presidency. It also says in its last item, it says that the president can also exercise other functions established or as determined by the Constitution of Ukraine. So we need to check if president does something that causes suspicions. We can read the Constitution and compare his actions with the descriptions of his possible functions in the Constitution. So, as was already mentioned, for the last 26 years we have never had this mechanism of impeachment. As far as the presidency is concerned, we still have as the effective law the law on the president of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, adopted yet in 1991. The other branches of power and the other highest offices of the country, they have newer laws establishing their functioning. But since 1991, there have never been a new law on the functions and authorities of the presidency, including the option or an option of suspending his or her powers. So we also have the situation when not only does not the law prescribe any mode of action, so to say, in case the president breaches the law, but there is no authority, no power body established by any law of Ukraine that in which this power to initiate the impeachment is vested. The only body that can initiate this, or rather work out the decision or the draft of the decision to impeach the president, is this temporary investigative committee that was mentioned earlier. But we do not have any description of how this commission is formed, how should it operate, and so on and so forth. So there is no mechanism that that can make a president feel any boundaries in his functions and decisions. And as has already been mentioned, there has been the whole variety of different violations, different breaches by the presidents of different laws and the constitution itself. Like, for example, one of the recent examples of the president appointing the members, for example, of the National Energy Commission, the National Economic Council, and the National Bank. Can anybody tell me where these numbers for these appointees is by which law is it established, or are these numbers established? Like, for example, five members of the board of the National Bank, and so on and so forth. So what happens when a president breaches the law, when he or she goes out of the limits prescribed by the Constitution? The president makes, pretends that nothing happens. He's just, exercising his constitutional powers, and I object by saying that there is Article 106, which clearly establishes the powers of the president, and he cannot go, any president may not go beyond the powers established by that article of the Constitution. What happens if a president makes a reference to any other specific laws, like, for example, the law on banks and banking activity, and so on and so forth? The presidency is equipped by, the legal expertise bodies who are supposed to give their expert opinion on whether this or the other decision of the president is constitutional and lawful. Wherever we have the instances of the allotment or apportioning of different functions, of money, different funding for various parts of the economy of the country, there we should be attentive as to what laws prescribe the actions or inactions by the presidential office, by the presidency. So the main law of our proposal is not to reverse the previous decisions that we deemed unconstitutional or unlawful, but to prevent these occurrences in the future. For example, we suggest that President's intervention in the work of the other power bodies or bodies of the government of Ukraine be considered, be established as unlawful. So if the president crosses the boundaries of his functions as established by the Constitution, these actions of his need to be considered unlawful. For example, when we look through into some of the decrees by the president, we can you can see there, for example, the decisions on the investment council or some educational board in Chernihiv Oblast and so on. But if we open the Constitution, we can, or any law that describes the functions and authorities of the highest governments of the highest bodies of the government of Ukraine, you can only see that these pertained to the functions of the cabinet of ministers of the government, not of the presidency. So we do not need to wait until the situation is so that the president can be accused of the breach of some criminal act, but when the president's acts are unconstitutional, where he exceeds his authority or powers. In our draft law, we also prescribe the mechanism for the terms of publishing of all the acts signed by the president. In 2014, for example, there was an example of non-constitutional developments when the then president, Mr. Yanukovych, fled the country. There was no law prescribing how to act for the other agencies of the government, what they were supposed to do. We tried to fill in this gap too by saying that if the president stops performing his functions, then he is removed from his office and he ceased to act as ceases to act as the guarantor of the constitution. I also endorse my colleagues in their view of the Article 111. This article is very complicated and the procedure that it establishes is also complicated with the number of votes in the parliament. But what is important here is the activity of this investigative committee. That's a needed, so to say, part of this procedure, needed component, because it helps to establish whether there was, in fact, a breach of constitution or a law or not. And then the votes in the parliament can only support, confirm, so to say, this decision or not, or reject it. If there is now a discussion in our country, in our society, whether, for example, in 2014 any breach of the constitution occurred when the president fled the country, whether he breached by that a constitution, nobody can produce any convincing arguments. So far, trying to familiarize myself with all the views on this impeachment procedure, I have never heard any specific views on how this investigative committee or commission be selected or appointed or established. How is the president going to continue his functions, for example, since the time this commission or committee starts investigating him, and so on and so forth. So, in our draft, in our bill, we emphasize the existing mechanism as prescribed by Article 111, but we need to bear in mind that if there are 226 votes of the MPs initiating this procedure, and it can be initiated by any part of the government, or a specific number of MPs, we suggest in our draft that the president be suspended, his functions be suspended, so that he or she cannot influence, unlawfully press, for example, the prosecutor general or any other law enforcement agency that would assist in the workings of this special investigative commission or committee. We also emphasize that all of the members, except for the secretary of this commission, should be lawyers by profession. We cannot tolerate the situation that we now have with the prosecutor general, who is not a lawyer at all. The only two people in this commission that may not be lawyers, professional lawyers, are the secretary and the head of the commission. If we take into account that during this investigation process the president is the main subject of of this investigation, then we might assume that the president is the most interested person in the quick outcome and the quick results of this of the work of this commission. So, if there are any grounds for the accusations against the president, or the lack thereof, these conclusions should be arrived at as soon as possible. And this committee, by the way, in our view, is a fully fledged investigative body. We need to establish somehow the functions of these of the members of this committee, of those investigators, of those special prosecutors. So we need to define the functions and the authorities of the members of this commission, as if they are the members of a fully fledged law enforcement investigative body. Therefore, we think that we suggest this commission as a realistically effective and efficient tool, instrument of investigation. And it is also important to see to it that the members of that committee are good specialists, because we have seen many cases in Ukraine where there have been very vocal accusations, but in the course of the investigation nothing happened, and they resulted in a flip. So the MPs and the parliamentary fractions should take part in the formation of this investigative committee. They will be checking each other and balancing each other, different political parties, that is, while forming this committee, enhancing, therefore, its objectivity. So this special committee or commission should produce its conclusions, publish its findings, submit them to the parliament. Then the Constitutional Court makes its ruling on whether the work of this committee was constitutional and the parliamentary procedure is constitutional. And that is also going to be a check, so to say, upon the wrongdoings against the president, guaranteeing his rights. Please get one slide back. I want herewith to emphasize the preventive, so to say, role of this impeachment mechanism or procedure. Historically speaking, I hope that after that Maidan revolution, we would be able to adopt quickly that impeachment, that law on the impeachment procedure, or the changes that would bring about the impeachment, because the president himself said that as soon as I become a guarantor of the Constitution, here we had his quotation from one of his speeches. He claimed to become a guarantor of the Constitution and norms and provisions of the Constitution without ever exceeding or going beyond the limits, he emphasized, the current president emphasized in that speech, beyond the limits set by the Constitution. So again, I would like to say that I view the impeachment mechanism or procedure as a means to prevent any more revolutions like the one we had a couple of years ago. Mr. Dobrodomov, MP, the MP has the floor. Well, our party also sustains this bill. In my view, it has it's high time that similar law is be adopted by the Parliament of Ukraine. Analyzing the draft that we now discuss, I'd say that there was a broad coalition after that revolution of 2014, which was perfectly capable of amending the constitution as it liked and also implement the provisions of the agreement that the political parties that compose that formed the coalition, the parliamentary coalition majority, signed at that time. But as it was not done yet, we still confront this constitutional collision situation. We know that in order to initiate the impeachment, we need to form the investigative committee, but we do not have any clear understanding of what this committee is, who can be the members, how it's selected, and so on, or elected, or appointed, and so on and so forth. So there have been in the parliament previously some temporary investigative commissions, but never have there been any dealing with such a thing as an impeachment of the president of the country. So even if the majority of the MPs are reluctant to vote to amend the existing article of the Constitution, which vaguely describes this impeachment procedure, then it's difficult to say what are the prospects of ever adopting this impeachment procedure legislatively, so to say. But still I have hopes that it might happen, that at least in a matter of 2 years there will be new general elections, and there will be the new parliament, and maybe the new MPs will be able to adopt the draft that or the bill that we are now discussing, and thus we'll adhere to this need of having this mechanism incorporated into our Constitution. I've looked through a number of draft texts from Democratic Alliance Party and the other political forces. Well, I was going, in fact, to ask you what's the best way of making this possible. Well, strategically speaking, a lot of views they are legally correct. That is important. They are written in accordance with the Constitution, with the laws, and the bill that the previous speaker mentioned has already been mentioned, has already been registered by the Parliament. I was the one who initiated the collection of signatures of the MPs after the Panama Papers scandal. But there were only 6 or 7 MPs who signed that petition, trying to, to establish a provisional, a temporary commission to investigate the claims of the contained in the Panama Papers regarding the Ukrainian MPs and members of government. Therefore, I would like to express my gratitude to the legal experts who become involved into this process. It's only with their help that we managed to formulate this, to draft this bill. Because I indeed agree that today, legally speaking, the situation in the country is such that the president can do or do not things at will, entirely, as he pleases, let us hope that the final version will be very different from when this norm of the impeachment is included into our constitution or any other law. It will make the situation entirely different as compared to the one we have now in our political life. I would like to invite Mr. Musiyaka, who is also the member of this working group on the reanimation, transformation, reform reanimation package of reforms. So what are your views on how to make this impeachment mechanism workable, so to say? Well, the first thing I would like to point out is that, especially having heard this assessment of, very weak prospects for the current composition of the parliament, willing to being, desirous of approving this impeachment procedure and incorporating it into the constitution or through any other law, enacted through any other law. Let me remind you that I was among the authors of the first drafts invoking this impeachment procedure many years ago. Again, those 2 votes, they seemed rather problematic even at that time, because the MPs were telling me even at that time that even to put this issue into the business order of business of the parliament, more than half of the votes will be needed. But I was trying to convince them that even by raising this issue, you would, improve the problem recognition, so to say, so that the public at large understands that the president is, engaged in violations, in wrongdoings. If I'm not mistaken, yet in mid-1997, Mr. Lavrinovich, who at that time was the chairman of the parliamentary committee, judiciary committee, and I was at that time ill, but I assisted at the work of that committee. It was the end of one parliamentary session, and the agenda for the next session was being formulated. And then Mr. Lavrinovich suggested that we start the impeachment procedures. The then president Mr. Kuchma, that is. But at that time, the major barrier was that there has been no legal norms on these investigative committees or commissions. So the decision was that the committee adopts or works out its decision and maybe work out or develop a bill on the impeachment. And in 1997 we adopted a similar law. What law do you have in mind? Yeah, do you mean? Oh, that was the law on establishing these or describing these investigative commissions, how they were supposed to be formed, and it gained support in the parliament. There were 305 votes in favor, but the president never signed it. Was that Mr. Kuchma? Yes, it was him. I was the president's representative in the parliament, and Mr. Sirota, who was a member of the Commission on the Constitution of Ukraine that was drafted and being discussed at that time. So we each day went to the president's administration and were trying to convince people there so that they convince the president to sign it. And as the parliament establishes, for example, or the constitution establishes the provision for the extraordinary disbandment of the parliament. You remember that was Article 90, saying that if the parliament for 2 months in a row cannot adopt any law, that means that there is no working majority in the parliament, and so the parliament is to be disbanded. And what happened? That article was also under discussion at that time, and for example, one of the people told me that it's very easy to disband the parliament. One just needs to introduce a draft of the budget, of the annual budget, that the parliamentarians, the MPs, will be reluctant to adopt. And that might easily cause a constitutional crisis, the dissolution of the parliament. So it was sort of a, trade, one article or one law for the other. And in order to save the parliament, we tried to save the parliament. Mr. Petro, let me remind you that we only have 20 minutes and there are 2 more speakers after you. Well, let me finish by saying that when the president at that time didn't sign a law but didn't veto a law either, then it can be enacted by the signature of the Speaker of the Parliament. And that norm seemed to me, something out of question entirely. That was something entirely ludicrous. I'm saying that in order to remind you how in other countries, like for example in the United States, this mechanism of impeachment is activated. a single member of Congress can just introduce a resolution calling for an impeachment, and then certainly there should be a vote of 2/3 of the members of Congress. So my view is that this Article 111 should be amended. For example, the issue of impeachment is introduced. 226 votes are needed in order to include this issue into the business of Parliament. I'm also of the opinion that even that temporary investigative commission is not needed. I was one of the members of such a commission, and I must tell you that we coped without this special prosecutors and so on and so forth. So I'm saying all this in order to remind you that be aware that there will be those obstacles like 226 votes, then 300 votes, and so on. And the last thing I wanted to say with regard to former President Yanukovych, there was no other way of proceeding for the government of Ukraine. They declared him, he was supposed to be declared as the one who removed himself basically from the office of the president. I would only add to this that any such action should be described in Ukrainian law as a foundation, as the basis for the removal of an incumbent president from office. So was I correct in understanding what you were saying as you suggested without this impeachment commission or the procedure without investigative commission? Yes, that's what I meant. Miss Yulia, you have 5 minutes, and the other speaker will also have 5 minutes. Well, I'll try to limit myself to 5 minutes. The Center for Political and Legal Reforms has, for the last 20 years, been involved in constitutional law analysis. What I would like to share with you, impeachment problem, in our view, is not an essential, so to say, or the most topical among the constitutional problems. In 2014, both the Parliament and the President, they removed or deleted, so to say, from the business of Parliament the attempts to introduce into the Constitution the system of checks and balances among the branches of power in Ukraine. Therefore, I hope that we also hope that after that revolution of 2014, there would be a real constitutional reform, as it is described in the chapter 13 of the Constitution. And in principle, those were the people who did not pretend to gain any new positions. They got together in order to develop these constitutional amendments. And Article 11, thank you, Democratic Alliance, that you, so to say, galvanized it a little bit. I'd say that similar mechanisms are needed for all branches of government of Ukraine, for the executive and judiciary and legislative. We, in our work, proceeded from the notion of the importance of four of four problems. First, the situation after the elections of 2014. Second, the tendency towards authoritarianism of Ukraine's presidency. This trend is typical for all the former Soviet republics. The third problem is the lack of the real political parties. And the fourth is very weak constitutional structure and the very weak constitutional court that is absolutely incapable of preventing the existing governmental agencies from any wrongdoings. Speaking about impeachment specifically, what I would like to say in support of Mr. Victor's ideas, impeachment procedure invoked by the parliament or initiated by the parliament as a so to say prevention of a crime, it needs to be based on the definition of what crimes constitute the basis for the impeachment. Then there is a procedure of the removal from office of the president. This should be separate from that issue of whether the president committed a crime. It's a procedural thing. The parliament needs to adopt this decision, to make this decision by a majority, much larger majority of votes than it does during ordinary votes of ordinary laws. I might agree that this procedure is quite overwhelming in the parliament. Lots of votes are needed. And that's what happened when former President Yanukovych fled. The impeachment was not used at that time because there were only 318 votes, if I'm not mistaken, in favor of that impeachment resolution. So I'm not at all sure whether this 338 votes threshold could ever be reached at all. And by the way, we do not need that number. We only need 300 votes, as the Constitution prescribes for the amendments of the Constitution itself. What else I wanted to say in conclusion? We would like to ask you not to introduce any bills that might contradict the Constitution, because it's up to us, to the Parliament, that we need to be a role model, so to say, for the other local governments, regional governments, and so on and so forth. We need to strengthen parliamentarianism in Ukraine, because unfortunately the presidency in Ukraine tends to move towards authoritarianism. Thank you. And Mr. Hatsko, who is the co-chairman of the party Democratic Alliance, I'm sure that you share Mr. Cherkasenko's position, but if this situation with a large number of votes needed, and that the presidents, as it happened in the past, are reluctant to even discuss these components of this, even components of this procedure, what should be done for this impeachment mechanism to be included into Ukraine's law? Well, thank you first of all for this discussion, because this discussion is needed, and for this impeachment procedure to ever appear in Ukraine, in Ukrainian law, I think we need to discuss it right now. Impeachment is the thing, is so to say, a mechanism that is needed in the legislation of any country. At the same time, I'm aware of the view of a lot of people who say that it's not at all topical. Impeachment as such is far from being the problem of utmost importance in Ukrainian constitutional law. With regard to the current president and why we discuss this issue now is the fact that I have also met a lot of people, basically two large groups of people. One of them says that the president Poroshenko should be removed. The other ones say that you have already removed a number of presidents, and so what? Is it what Ukraine needs now? So, how we should proceed? With Mr. Poroshenko, let me remind you, in addition to what Mr. Yurii said, that the impeachment procedure was supposed to be included into the coalition agreement in the among the parliamentary parties, but it somehow vanished from the draft of the coalition agreement. My view is that the president should have his functions guaranteed, so that there would be no ways of removing him or her unlawfully from the office. But on the other hand, this tendency towards usurpation of power that has already been mentioned, all this make us think of the importance of impeachment discussions. When we visited the United States some time ago, the State Department organized us a meeting with one of the constitutional law specialists who just wrote on the blackboard or pictured on a blackboard this procedure of checks, or rather the system of checks and balances. And I view that impeachment procedure as a part of that system of checks and balances. As was already mentioned, Ukrainian president is now unpunishable, and we need to do something about it right now, because if some people say that it's too early to deal with that now, it might happen so that it will be too late to deal with that sometime in the future. So we have a lot of debates, speculations even around this issue, but I would agree that this impeachment procedure should be made realistic. For example, when Mr. Yanukovych signed with the then Russian President, Mr. Medvedev, the agreements and contracts in Kharkov, there was a big outcry among many Ukrainians, and it was because of the lack of this impeachment procedure. Many Ukrainians thought that it was easier to organize a revolution rather than go through parliament with that impeachment procedure. Therefore, I think that speaking about the existing description of the procedure by the Constitution of Ukraine, I think that this final vote of 3/4 of the votes for the final decision to remove a president from office should be reduced to 2/3. And then I think that the definition part stating the reasons for the impeachment should be added by the formula breaches of constitution. All the other parts, I think, could be discussed in the parliament. Although I consider our today's discussion very useful, because our today's discussion shows that a lot of views converge. For example, about the need to simplify this Article 111 of the Constitution, and thus make it such an effective instrument that any president be afraid or would become afraid of violating the Constitution. Well, thank you very much for your contribution. I have even no time for conclusions, but I still am going to express my suggestion that Ukrainian Media Center, being such a popular center, can organize another discussion, maybe even more broad-scale discussion, because a lot of media just are not interested in bringing this issue to the attention of the public at large. Therefore, I think that in addition to the parliamentary hearings mechanism, there can also be the discussions like our today's discussion used in order to improve this area of constitutional law. With that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.